on top of it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Are you the moderator?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Yeah, you know, Yvonne continues to make it look like my lab knows what it's doing.
Ah.
Well, your lab does. Maybe the lab leader doesn't, but the lab does.
Right. The lab does. So it just continues to make me look like I'm, you know, up on things.
There you go. That's my strategy, is surround myself with people that know what they're doing. That's how,
exactly
how you do it.
People that make you look good.
Yeah.
So we're a little stormy here, and my internet has been a slightly unstable, but hopefully, fingers crossed.
We got drenched the past couple of days. We had, I mean, just locally here in Clemson, we had like 6 inches of rain just in the past 2 days.
Good Lord.
Yeah. And we hadn't had any since the hurricane. Like it'd been dry.
Oh, I know.
Then, so.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we definitely need the rain. There's no doubt.
Well, it looks like we're at time. Welcome back, everyone. And I will turn this over to Ruth to kick off our Colonial Waterbird Management and Monitoring session.
Good deal. Thank you so much, Allison. Yeah. Welcome back, everyone. And my name is Ruth Boettcher. I'm with the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, and I'm the lead for the Colonial Waterbird Management and Monitoring session. And we have three rather diverse talks, I think, so it'll be an interesting session. And Yvan Satgé, I hope I pronounced this right, Satgé, is going to start things off with his presentation entitled Atlas of Breeding Sites for Waterbirds in the Northern Gulf of Mexico, a new tool to facilitate the management and conservation of waterbirds along coastal Northern Gulf of Mexico. So go ahead and take it away.
Thank you, Ruth. Hopefully you can see the main slide. So my co-authors on this project are Kelly Hickson and Pat Jodes from Clemson and the South Carolina Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, and also Jeff Gleason from U.S. Fish and Wildlife at the Chiefland office in Florida. So if you were at Waterbirds last year or the AMBC, you probably saw an earlier version of this presentation. Hopefully this is the last one we're giving on this project because it means it's reaching completion. So back in 2010, when the Deepwater Horizon spill occurred, NERDA biologists scrambled to locate information on where the colonies of seabirds or waterbirds were, and they needed to be either protected or used for assessment. So that led to different stakeholders across the Gulf of Mexico to try and merge together data sets of breeding data. So there is a wide array of stakeholders just across the 5 states, but more recently with GOMA, the Gulf of Mexico Avian Monitoring Network, and the Gulf Coast Joint Venture, that started an effort to do the atlas I'm going to present today. And the need was for an integrated regional atlas that could hopefully inform decision making in terms of crises like oil spills or others, but also restoration planning, habitat management, monitoring, and then marine spatial planning or coastal spatial planning. So the goals of the atlas, which is called the Atlas of Breeding Sites for Waterbirds in the Northern Gulf of Mexico, is to help address those information gaps that were identified by the GOMAN, but also to unite the different data sets that exist and publicize them, not publish them, but publicize them, made them known that they existed. And also complement a recent effort that we did for the Southeast that were never published, and then hopefully integrate the Avian Knowledge Network effort. So what the atlas I'm going to present does is to share site-based information. So the information is linked to sites across the region. It archives historical data that's not current. We call it an atlas because it's the spatial depiction of the Gulf. It's a spatial platform, and then it should assist with management decision. What it does not provide status and trend estimates, and neither should it be used for that. And I'll explain why. It's not a data repository for any waterbird data, just breeding data. Right now, it's not a place to download data, although once the Fish and Wildlife gets the product and work with the stakeholder, the data provider. They may accept to or may decide to make it downloadable. It includes some inland colonies, but it's supposed to be coastal, so I'll give some details on that too. And it's only breeding locations, so no staging, roosting, or stopover unless they are at breeding locations. So in terms of projects, so the need was identified following the Gulf. The technical advisory team was established in 2022. And then following stakeholder input, sites were either identified as part of the process or previously identified by the stakeholders. Then data was shared, QA/QC by our team. So the bottom part is more what we did, and the top part is more what the group did. So we QA/QC the data, reorganized it, cleaned it, selected the platform, and then tested it. And now it's being transferred to Fish and Wildlife Service. So I just got access, to good level of access to bring it to the Fish and Wildlife Services ArcGIS online. And at the same time, USGS, because we're using R, asked us to do a code review. So we did that at the same time. So peer review the coding, the R scripts. And so hopefully next year will be published. The technical advisory team, so their names are listed here, representing the different data providers from across the Gulf. They're there for advice. In terms of data, we had 7 data providers listed here as well, so including either usually state wildlife agencies or NGOs across the 5 states. And there were 2 types of surveys, mostly ground surveys, but also aerial surveys done all around the Gulf by the Deepwater Horizon region-wide TIG. And so that's also adding a different level of complexity to the data set. Speaking of complexity, we got 42 data sets going from what you would expect from this kind of data. So Excel files, CSVs, or Access and GIS shape files. But we also had to go and mine Word documents, PDF and PowerPoints that were given to us, a bit of the bottom drawers. So we did all the data cleaning and data manipulations in R. And that's because we wanted this to be reproducible if needed in the future to add new data, but also to keep a track of what we were doing and be transparent on what decisions we were making in choosing which data to show and which data not to show or to manipulate the data. So the R script was reviewed for USGS and will be in actually a GitLab repository, the USGS GitLab repository. Temporary, so from 2010 to 2022, but not all data sets cover this whole period. There's actually not a single year when all data sets are, all providers have data for that same year. Especially so for the inland boundary, we had to find a boundary that makes sense. And so we decided to choose NOAA's Coastal Change Analysis Program, CCAP. And for that, we aggregated the estuarine habitat categories, so that created the coastal footprint for the data. So that's what's in green on the map. And then we cut that for Florida. We actually cut just north of Key Largo because there is a gap in colonies sites, and there's Route 1 that actually was a great boundary. So we choose that to cut Florida between the Gulf and the Atlantic. Although some may say that the Strait of Florida is more Atlantic than Gulf, but so there's 1,740 independent sites here on the map, the different colors of different providers. And then that's about 31,000 survey records. So that's with absence data. If we look only at presence data, that's about 20,000. So 2/3 of those records are presence data. And some of them can be, it's a small number, but it could be just present. It was not a number, it was just acknowledging the fact that a species was present or not. So there are 42 species. Some of them we had to group them, unfortunately, like the reddish egrets morphs, because this information was collected in Texas, but not in other sites. So it was not consistent across. And actually for the species that were not included for the same reason, oyster catchers were not recorded across the Gulf, so we did not include them. And then others that were grouped, like some that are hard to distinguish, like glossy ibis and white-faced. and some were just a big colony like royal and sandwich terns. Those colonies are too big to identify each species. Metrics, so that's where the limitations start. Unfortunately, the providers did not collect the data using the same units. So they mostly connected nests or pairs or adults, and it's either or. And so we had to choose those 3 units, which we call metrics for the atlas, because they represent 99% of the data provided to us or records. But each one does not totally cover each data set. Some of them, like the Florida rooftop colony database, is only adults. And I don't know if you were there when Ruth presented yesterday, but she mentioned that for the Avian Knowledge Network effort, they chose nests as the single unit for that effort, and where there would be calculation being made if pairs are being collected, and it would be transformed to nests, or same for adults. In our case, we decided not to do that because we didn't have a good handle on the methodologies or the protocols used to get those numbers. And sometimes those data were too old, or also they were collected by citizen scientists in the case of Florida. And so the transformation from whichever metric to nest is not consistent. But in any case, all metrics will be available in what we call a registry, which is basically the underlying data, a giant CSV file, for example. And then each site has a record of all metrics available that have been collected. So for the atlas itself, for the user interface, we chose ArcGIS Online with the GitHub that's used for storing all the methodology in the R script. We chose that because it's easily accessible, well, easily usable by the public, and also USGS and Clemson and the Fish and Wildlife have subscriptions to it. The problem is it's subscription-based, and I don't know if people have used ArcGIS Online, but not all products work together. Not all products or tools offer the same level of manipulation. But anyway, so this is what the atlas looks like for now. It has a big disclaimer that needs to be accepted, where we explain the limitations of the data sets. It has a tutorial that people can use, but mostly it's the sites are located on the map that can be filtered or selected. So there is a set of filter, a typical one you would find. And then the map, yeah, as I said, it can be selected on map. So if you want just one area, you could select that area, you get information from that area. And that will actually calculate totals at the bottom in each metric when those data are available. At the same time, the site column here provide what we call the site card, which has information on each site, geographical information like coordinates, but also who collected the data, which species are there, years, a citation for the data set, point of contact, all this information. And then, I don't know why I had a yellow arrow here, but anyway. So in terms of possible development for this effort, so once it's made public, and that will be the decision of the Fish and Wildlife Service, we created it for them, so they're the ones now in charge. And they will decide if it's public to anybody or to certain stakeholders. So well, a deployment could be to include site attributes like what Ruth described about habitat or stewardship of sites. But also, I think something we need to do with GoMan and the Gulf Ventures is to discuss regional monitoring standards that would allow those status and trend analysis to be done at the regional level. It could be expanded spatially to the southeast because they will know their population moving from one side of Florida to the other, and also hopefully integrate into the Avian Knowledge Network effort. So thanks for data providers. Here is the main point of contact. There are more people who work with us to integrate the data into the atlas, technical advisory team, and that was funded by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Man. That was great. And I'm really pleased to hear that could potentially be integrated into the AKN, because that was going to be my big question.
Am I still sharing my screen? Sorry.
No.
Okay, good. Yeah,
Yes.
about the avian knowledge network effort, it would not be, well, hopefully it won't be us. I think it's a bigger effort than we can handle, but yeah, it would be great if that could be done in the future, for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we'll just have some comments in the chat. Fantastic work. Vanya. Have to run for meeting. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, basically just good comments.
I see Ariel's. I can
Yeah,
start
yeah.
answering Ariel's.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's where it was like a Matryoshka design, because there is Arc map on map viewer online, which is within a dashboard. So that's where the filtering is happening, and then that's within a what they call experience in ArcGIS Online, and that's more the user interface with the information on the left, with about more like the metadata and information of who are the providers, who are the team, and then also the link to the methodology in the R script. So it's a link, a mix of dashboard, experience, and map.
And Evans also mentioned that he's working on standardizing colony surveys, among other things. So, you know, I mean, these types of efforts, we both know, are extremely challenging.
Yeah.
And,
especially
you know,
when
trying to
working
get
with,
everyone on the, pardon?
I was going, especially with working with historical data.
Oh,
you know, moving forward, hopefully
even
those
go there.
standards can be used, but when you use the data we're collecting in different ways, it's very hard to put it back together.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's definitely a huge undertaking. So this is great work. I really like this. Does anyone have any other questions that would like to speak up, or? All right. Well, if not, I guess we'll move on, and I think I'm on next, and I apologize. I think I'm going to actually turn off my camera just because I'm a little nervous about the internet. So anyway, let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that all right?
Looks good.
Thank you. Minimize this, sorry. Okay, all right, good deal. So I just want to start off by acknowledging my co-authors from the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, or DWR, the Virginia Tech Shorebird Program, and the Nature Conservancy's Virginia Coast Reserve. So my talk focuses on one question stemming from a much larger story involving Virginia's largest seabird breeding colony located at a highly urbanized site that has since been temporarily relocated to an adjacent artificial island and several industrial barges. And that question is whether urban colonies surrounded by extreme levels of human activity and noise can serve as population sources. And I am not, oh dear, I'm not advancing again. All right, I'm going to try, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop. Try this again and go via screen. Still not advancing. I tried both ways, Allison. Sorry. I'm gonna try one more
No
time.
worries. Do you want me to try to share? I only have
Well,
one slide.
I didn't update. Yeah, I didn't update the talk. It worked after trying this a few times. Sorry.
How it goes.
God darn it. I am so sorry, you guys.
If you try not being in presenter mode, you might be able to at least go through the slides.
Yeah, I hate to do that. All right. All right, well, you're just gonna have to see the ugly version then. So let me
Well,
get out of.
It'll just be a little small. It'll be great.
I'm sorry. Ugh. All right. Let's try this again. All right, I'm just gonna click on the individual slides. Sorry about that. Oh, you know what? And I also have, oh shoot, this is gonna be a little awkward because I have transitions. Anyway, you guys can see that, right?
Yes.
All right. So the urban site that I'm referring to is the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, or the HRBT, which is part of the I-64 corridor, where it crosses the mouth of the James River between Norfolk and the city of Hampton. And these two artificial islands anchor the existing east and westbound tunnels. And the original seabird colony was located on South Island, and the little attached appendage is Fort Wool, the artificial island to where the colony has been temporarily relocated. So roughly 80,000 vehicles travel through the HRBD per day. And if that isn't enough, South Island and Fort Wool is a little less than 2 miles to the north of the Naval Air Station. So not only is there a high volume of cars and trucks passing through 24/7, there's near constant air traffic overhead, mostly during daylight hours, but still it's loud. So all in all, it's just a very busy, loud, disturbed space. Sorry, these slides are going to look awkward. So South Island Colony was first formed in 1983 with common terns and black skimmers as the two pioneering species. And this was back in the day when things were a lot quieter and much easier to manage. And over the years, other species began nesting at the site. And by 2007, South Island became Virginia's largest seabird breeding colony, averaging over 15,000 breeding adults. And one of the more abundant species was the royal tern, which did not show up until 2006, but by the following year, over 90% of the state's breeding population began nesting on South Island. Then in the fall of 2017 came the approval of Virginia's largest transportation initiative, the HRBT expansion project. And the project's bottom line objective for the birds was their permanent removal from South Island. And the justification that was given for removing the birds is that they would impede and be negatively impacted by construction activities. And all of the additional infrastructure resulting from the expansion project will leave no room for birds in the future. And now that construction is well underway, I believe both statements to be true. You can see by the photo on the right, there isn't like a square foot of undisturbed real estate remaining on South Island. And these constructions activities are pretty much 24/7 throughout most of the year, that's generated from all the machinery and equipment. It's all that noise is just very audible throughout the entire area. All right, and then unfortunately, the approval for the HRBT expansion project came when the M opinion of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was in effect, which allowed for the incidental take of birds. So we really had no way to mitigate for the loss of the South Island colony. So in the end, it was actually a very vocal birding community demanding something be done for the birds that captured the attention of the governor's office. And so in February 2020, just as the HRBT expansion project got underway, the governor delivered a directive that included these two components. The first stated that DWR will create new temporary habitat on Fort Wool and the barges. And the second mandated that DWR work with the Corps of Engineers to construct a new nesting island, which is currently in the works. So immediately following the governor's directive, DWR staff obtained the necessary permits and hired contractors to convert Fort Wool, which is a 5-acre state and national historic military landmark, into a seabird breeding site. So in less than 3 months, we created about 1.5 acres of nesting habitat on Fort Wool. And at the same time, DWR got permits to lease and anchor commercial barges in the embayment between Fort Wool and South Island. So we placed suitable nesting substrate on the top side of the barges, which created a little over 1 acre of additional habitat. And here's an overview of what we call the South Island Fort Wool Barge Complex. Thankfully, our efforts proved to be successful with the help of audio lures and decoys. And there were also efforts taken on the part of the Virginia Department of Transportation to get the birds off the island, South Island. So royal terns and laughing gulls immediately began nesting on Fort Wool, while common terns, gull-billed terns, and black skimmers occupied the barges. While the distribution of these species has shifted a little bit over the years and new species have come on the scene, royal terns and laughing gulls remain the dominant species on Fort Wool, and common terns, gull-billed terns, and skimmers have confined their nesting activity to the barges. And so the rest of my talk is going to focus on royal terns, which for the purposes of this talk serve as a proxy for determining whether South Island and Fort Wool colonies are population sources. So presented here are annual peak royal tern nest counts derived from photos to give you a sense of the current population since the relocation of the colony from South Island to Fort Wool. And despite the declines in nest abundance observed the past 2 years, Fort Wool still supports over 70% of Virginia's royal tern breeding population. And one of the most positive outcomes of the relocation of the South Island colony to Fort Wool and the barges has been the banding of thousands of terns, skimmers, and laughing gulls, an effort that began on South Island in 2018 following the approval of the HRBT expansion project. And this table shows the annual number of royal tern adults and young banded since 2018. All birds received a metal BVL band, and chicks large enough at the time of banding also received a uniquely coated plastic field readable band, or PFR, like the one shown in the red circle on the royal tern chick. So nearly all of the marked royal terns were banded as chicks, and of these, 66% received PFRs. An additional 226 adults were banded, all of which received the PFRs, or plastic field readable bands. So all told, over 14,000 royal terns were banded on South Island and Fort Wool between 2018 and 2023. Okay. Oh, this is terrible. I'm so sorry. I can't. Yeah. Anyway, so having a large population of marked royal terns is giving us an opportunity to determine if South Island and Fort Wool colonies are indeed contributing to the overall population, and also helping to establish age at first breeding. So this table shows the number of royal terns resighted on Fort Wool, and the column on the very left lists the cohort year and banding location, and the remaining paired columns present the total number of banded individuals resighted along with the number of confirmed breeders by year. And we define confirmed breeders as having been observed incubating, brooding, or feeding chicks. I do want to mention that reading bands in a royal tern colony and confirming breeding is not easy because royal terns nest in such close proximity to one another, and it's tough to see legs, much less read bands. And confirming breeding is even more challenging, especially after chicks become mobile and form creches. So kudos to the Virginia Tech team for getting as many resights as they did. So, and I'm going to, it's going to be a nightmare. I'll highlight some key observations. So within the 2018 South Island cohort, individuals were first observed breeding at Fort Wool in 2021 at 3 years of age, as I marked in the orange boxes. And then within the 2019 South Island cohort, the first confirmed breeding was observed in 2022, also at the at age 3, and that's the second orange box to the right. But when you get to the 2020 Fort Wool cohort, a handful of individuals were confirmed breeding at 2 years of age. And the same is true for the 2021 Fort Will cohort. And those are the blue boxes, right? So this is interesting because royal terns are known to start breeding at 3 years of age, but more often begin breeding at 4 and 5 years of age. And so these data suggest that a small portion of royals may actually begin breeding at 2 years. It's also important to point out that the overall number of banded royals resighted at Fort Will increased with each passing year. So it's possible that a portion of these were unconfirmed breeders, and those are all the yellow boxes. So you follow them from left to right. You can see those increases. Yikes. Okay. So in 2023, we conducted a coastwide colonial waterbird survey, and we observed quite a few banded individuals in Virginia's other 2 royal tern colonies, Clump Island, which is located in the Chesapeake Bay, and Cobb Island, which is a barrier island located off of the lower Delmarva Peninsula. And so we decided to go back and do some resighting surveys in these colonies. We visited each site twice, once in late July and again in early August. And despite the fact that our visits were late in the breeding season, we still encountered a significant number of adults with unfledged and fledged young in both colonies, indicating that they were still active. So we detected 185 different individuals that were banded on South Island or Fort Will as chicks in the Clump Island colony, and another 95 individuals in the Cobb Island colony. And of these, 76% were birds banded on South Island as chicks, indicating that they were at least 4 years old. So that's the group that's in the box. Although we didn't confirm breeding for the banded individuals that we detected, the fact that they were definitely of breeding age suggests that they were likely breeding in these colonies. So in 2024, we visited each colony 3 times, once in May, June, and July, to try to confirm breeding during peak incubation and brood rearing periods. And although we more than doubled the number of banded individuals detected at each site this year, we were only able to confirm breeding for a small proportion of our resites, including a few of the 2-year-old birds. So you can see we only confirmed breeding for 17% at Clump Island and 11% at Cobb Island. And then the number of confirmed breeders in 2022 at Fort Will, 5 and 1 were 2-year-old birds. Okay. So it was a little disappointing that we weren't able to confirm breeding for more birds. They're just packed in there so tightly, and both colonies had very uneven substrate with lots of dips and vegetation and objects blocking our view. So most of our resites were of birds standing or walking around in the colony. That said, almost all the birds we detected were inside or at the edge of colonies, allowing us to cautiously assume that most were breeders. Moreover, of the 408 marked individuals observed in the Clump Island colony, 88% were of breeding rate, were 3 years of age or older. And of the 215 individuals detected in the Cobb Island colony, 92% were 3 years or older, again, suggesting that they were breeders. All right, so circling back to the question posed in the title of the talk, are urban seabird colonies a source or sink? Our resighting efforts suggest that South Island and Fort Will royal tern fledglings are surviving and recruiting into other Virginia colonies. That said, we do realize that we need to figure out a better way to confirm breeding. In addition, royal terns banded at South Island Fort Will complex were observed breeding at the Horseshoe Island colony in New Jersey, providing evidence that birds originating in Virginia are recruiting into out-of-state colonies. And collectively, this work is helping justify the placement of the new seabird nesting island in the vicinity of South Island Fort Will at the location marked by this yellow little rectangle here on the map. So to that end, if you are working in a royal tern, common tern, gullible tern, or skimmer colony, please be on the lookout for birds carrying white PFR bands. And if you could report your resightings to the email that is here on the slide in red, that would be wonderful. And I think it would be of interest to a lot of folks working with royal terns, obviously, just looking at the interchange of these individuals among colonies. So I think with that, that's it. And again, I apologize for the clunkiness of the presentation. All right. So I guess it's, how much time do we have?
I think we move on to the next, and then whatever time remains will be available for questions for everybody.
Okay, that sounds great. All right.
You have a full 15 minutes, Joan, don't worry.
All right. So next up is Joan Walsh, who's going to present her talk, which is entitled Draft Results of Conservation and Climate Adaptation Planning at Great Gull Island. So Joan, if you can share your screen, which you have. So I think you're good to go.
Except we can't hear you, Joan.
How about now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's critical. Thank you so much for inviting us to give this talk. This has been a cooperative effort by more than 50 years of volunteers at Great Gull Island. And I want to thank my co-authors on this talk, as well as everyone who's worked on the island over the years. This is really something that we've all been part of.
I
Joan,
am
I
not
think
here.
we lost you. Sorry, Ruth.
Wow. How about now?
Yes, you're back.
And did the slide advance?
Yes, you're on the history slide, right?
Excellent. Okay. Great Gull Island's located about 7 miles south of New London, Connecticut and Long Island Sound. And prior to 1900, the island was primarily used as for sheep grazing by the neighboring lighthouse keeper. At the time, there were estimated to be around 7,000 terns nesting on the island. In 1900, the island was requisitioned by the U.S. Army as part of the coastal defense system, and it served as an army base until the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, the island was auctioned, and the American Museum of Natural History won the auction to restore the tern colony to the island. When the Army was there, as you can see from this aerial photo, they had altered essentially every inch of the island. A few of these buildings are still standing on the island. But after the Army left, the buildings were cleared, and starting in the early 1960s, the terns began to get restored on the island by volunteers led by Helen Hayes, with support from the Linnean Society and the American Museum of Natural History. In 2020, during the pandemic, there were administrative changes that were brought to the island, and it put us in a position of needing to make some decisions about the future of the island. And that called, when we sat down and we started thinking about how do we move forward to Great Gull Island 2.0, we thought the first thing that we needed was a comprehensive conservation plan. Let's see if we can advance.
Just have to unmute again. You're good now.
All right.
But it did not advance. Oh, there it did.
There it is. I think we just have a little Starlink lag. So in 2021, when we started to work on Great Gull Island 2.0, the conditions on the island were, there were around 10,000 common tern nests. The most recent full island count had been in 2019. There were in 2021, 1,400 roseate tern nests. The island is large. It's about 17 acres, and that makes conservation for this island a little bit different than some of the other tern islands that we talk about. Many of them are in the 1 to 2 acre range. This is very large, and management can be very expensive over that range. one of the things that Great Gull Island has going for it is there's no mammalian predators on the island. The island's separated by 7 to 9 miles of water, and we don't have rats, we don't have cats, we don't have dogs, we don't have coyotes, we don't have skunks, etc. The island is in private ownership with the American Museum of Natural History, a 501c3, which creates challenges sometimes, but it also provides a really good long-term stewardship for the island. But mostly what we were staring down was the fact that there was no conservation plan on the island. So when we sat down to think about what we needed to do from a conservation planning perspective, a few things were cross-cutting issues that we really could not avoid, no matter what aspect of the threats to this island that were brought up. The first one is that there's virtually no redundancy for Great Gull Island. Given the coastal pressures along the coast of New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, there is no place to stash 40,000 terns, which is what Gull Island has when it's in the peak swing with all the young and all the adults. There is the existential climate threats. There's warming waters affecting the prey base. There's sea level rise affecting the actual area of the island. There's increasing storm intensity, which is leading to incredible amounts of erosion at Great Gull Island. We also sadly have no standing funding. There is no endowment, and there is no line item budget from the American Museum of Natural History. All of this, as everyone here who knows who manages tern colonies, these are management dependent species. As soon as we take our foot off the accelerator at Great Gull Island, we end up with invasive species returning, and we end up with gulls moving in to nest on the island. These are real challenges that cross-cut all of our conservation planning. So much like the storm petrel project that you heard about yesterday, the conservation planning for storm petrels, we turned to the open standards for the practice of conservation for being able to come up with a comprehensive plan that was led by a facilitator and that brought a group of people to a group decision that they were able to agree on. The first thing that we had to understand was programmatically, what do we do with a place this complex? What do we do with a place that's 19 acres, that has 40,000 birds on it, more than 20,000 nesting adults, and then chicks? What do we do with the existential threats that we have? What are the actions that we take, and how do we prioritize them? And then the next question, which is really important, is how do we know that what we do works? We didn't have anything in place for understanding these two critical management questions. So we chose Foundations of Success, Caroline Stem at Foundations, to lead us through this process. For the most part, many of you have seen this wheel before. We have worked through the assess and plan stages 1 and 2. But because this has taken 2 years, we've taken some of our ideas all the way through the analyze and adapt phase. The process goes through scope, vision, and purpose, target setting, threat identification, threat reduction, viability and monitoring plan. We did this in two-day workshops over 2 years. We had more than 20 participants. What takes the most time is really talking through and coming to a community consensus about what the threats and the threat reduction processes are. We also did standardized community interviews. We had lots of follow-up homework, and we've had weekly meetings for the last 2.5 years for this. So the first part of this that we dealt with is the scope and vision. This is what I call the wedding vows that we have to Gull Island. This is where you actually get to do some deep thinking about where do we want this conservation plan to apply to, and we really drew the boundaries for almost all of our discussions at the boundary of Great Gull Island. What is our vision? What do we want to see in the future? We want to see Great Gull Island restore and thrive, and we want it to continue to be a source population for the terns in the Western North Atlantic. And then what's the purpose? What's the why? we need to increase our confidence that what we're doing on Great Gull Island is actually working. We have to understand what we need to measure and what those measurements mean. So we set our targets for no big surprise that our targets were the endangered roseate tern and common tern. Common tern are brought into this party because roseates always nest with common terns in the Northwest Atlantic. And one thing that we were not expecting was how heavily our work focused on dealing with the physical assets of the island. You can see the remains of the Army fort on this island, and those remains we call legacy structures, and many of those legacy structures are crumbling. One of the reasons this island is still here is because of the legacy structures, the jetties, the riprap, and the concrete aprons that held gun emplacements, and it's one of the biggest threats that we have right now. So for one day, we focused on looking at the threat profile for Great Gull Island. And when you look at the threat profile, when you go through one of these analyses, you look at the scope on how much of the target is affected over 10 years by these threats. How severe will it be, and how irreversible will it be? This takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of breakout groups and a lot of work. And eventually, you get to a place that really makes sense. And one of the things that was really surprising to us is what we came out with. This was already a learning process. What we came out with at the very beginning is our threats when they were ranked. Existing and new invasive plants and introduced ground predators came out as our priority threats, which speaks to biosecurity, which is something that will follow for the next minute or two. Each of these threats has now a theory of change for how we will address that threat to have a threat reduction plan. Some of them roll in very nicely together. Others do not, sort of, they're off on their own. The other thing that is important to understand is that just because marine debris is ranked as a low threat, it's still a threat. And if there's an opportunity to address it, and we can do that in a low cost and highly efficient way, we will do that. It can jump over human disturbance or offshore wind if there's an opportunity. So when we took all of those threats and rolled them into sort of common themes, we were able to come up with these 9 theories of change that we developed. Increasing biosecurity planning, enhancing nesting habitat, monitoring the prey base, securing the shoreline, stabilizing those legacy structures, disease and toxins monitoring, controlling avian predators, assessing and mitigating for the impacts of offshore wind, and removing marine debris. These are all of these have a worked out theory of change, and we're going to follow one part of the increased biosecurity planning. So this is the theory of change for biosecurity. It's kind of it's kind of spaghetti, but it's also shorthand. So if we take the time to follow just one part of this, down at the very bottom is our biosecurity plan for preventing mammal and vegetation introductions, which is really key at Great Gull Island. Since we don't have any ground predators, if we go through a shoreline restoration, we have to make sure we don't get any ground predators. We have to make sure that any machines that come on the island to do shoreline restoration, that they don't introduce Phragmites, which we just about have off the island, or any new invasive plants. So the strategy is to develop and implement the biosecurity plan, that little hexagon off on the left, and then it takes us through a series of intermediate results and activities that we need to engage in order to get ourselves further over to the right. The biosecurity plan is in place and it's funded. Then we go to personnel and visitors are aware and follow it. And then that allows us to actually say that we've been able to, that invasive plants and biosecurity hazards have been reduced, which then feeds into those green boxes supporting the terns and the habitat for the terns and the physical assets. For each of those threat reduction strategies, we are able to have a strategic plan that takes us through how we're going to reduce these. Now, there's these small turquoise boxes down there. They've got a purple triangle next to them. Those tell us what we need to monitor to understand, are we making progress? And so this feeds into our monitoring plan. Let me see if I can go back. So if you follow this, the purple triangle on the left where it says biosecurity down on the very bottom, and then you go forward, the biosecurity 1 goal is that we have a detection strategy in place for ground predators. And then there's an objective that's time bound. By April 2025, we need a detection strategy. We don't have one. And it's key for us to get one over this winter. And then it goes on to describe how we would monitor our progress on that. We have that for every one of these chains, and we have several hundred of these goals that we need to meet. So during this process, what are the 2024 conditions? We learned a lot just during the process. We were able to really make some advancements even on some of the things that we were just developing. We have at least 11,000 common tern nests on the island. We're going to do a full island count next year. Watch this space or contact myself, Peter Payton, or Margaret Revega if you have experience with working in a tern colony and you would like to help us with the full island count. We have 2,200 roseate tern nests on the island now, which is about 600 more than when we started in 2021. We've made significant progress on invasive plants. Peter Payton had a grant, and Margaret Revega has a grant now. We have standardized roseate box experiments and designs. You'll hear from Jess Espinosa about that tomorrow. And we have a draft conservation plan. Our next steps are for fundraising and governance, because those are 2 other gaps that we have to close on this island. And these are some of the people who helped. And I forgot the National Autobahn logo. But I want to thank everybody who was part of this process, and I want to thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Joan. That was great. I really like that biosecurity plan. I think I might have to ding you on that. Especially, as we move forward constructing the new seabird island. But anyway,
we can take 2 minutes out of the break, if that's okay with everyone, and go until 1:42 for questions.
So yeah, if anyone people are amazed by the photo of Great Gull Island. And who did your crazy. Wonderful tern drawings?
David Sibley did.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he's a longtime supporter of Great Gull Island, and it's great to have him on board whenever we get to tap him for things like that. Yeah, that's great.
That's really cool. Paul has a question. Paul, you're up if you are able.
You might be on mute, Paul.
Okay. Maybe we can jump to Liam in the meantime.
Hi, can you hear
me? Go ahead.
Oh, great.
Yes.
Thank you for a lovely talk. You talked about the need to avoid the threat of gulls moving in. Species like American herring gulls have been declining pretty consistently for a couple decades. And so in the spirit of how, I loved how forward thinking the whole plan was. Could you talk a little bit about how plans or perspectives or goals might shift in the context of declining gull populations, or not at all?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Liam, and it's one of those sort of push me, pull yous, right? There's a level of gull predation that we are very comfortable with at Great Gull Island. Generally, our gull predation comes from right next door. We're the grocery store. They live right next door. And it's mostly black-backed gulls coming in and taking young birds. 2 years ago, we had a real food shortage, and blackbacks started killing adults. they killed hundreds of common terns. We went over to the island and took a look at what they were taking. Of course, when you start taking adults, it's a whole different story. There's an expectation, right? Young birds have higher mortality rates. There's an expectation of that sort of loss. We would not be able to sustain gulls on Great Gull Island, and we don't do any gull control when there's a normal level of take. And herring gulls are typically not a problem for us. It's blackback gulls that are a problem. We haven't done control in several years on the island. But when we do, it's always very thoughtful and it's not blanket. But we could not let the gulls begin to nest on the island. That would be a bridge too far. There is about a mile away. There's a lighthouse that has hundreds of gull nests. So that's how we're working with that. They are taking commons, not adults, but they can take them in huge numbers in low food years. And be happy to talk if you've got any ideas or you'd like to work with us on what seems appropriate and what doesn't down the line. I mean, this is really a cooperative effort and we need all the help we can get. And outside voices are always really good because when you're in the middle of it, you have to make these choices when you're not in the field, right? We got to talk about this now. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a great answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
I see that Paul put a comment in the chat and comments on prey base. I'm assuming that question is directed to you, Joan, I believe. And Paul, if you can speak up.
Yeah, well, that's just it. I'd like to know a little more about prey base. It's a lot of terns, so there's a lot of food out there.
Yeah, we're working with Gemma's lab and with Gemma and with the whole team who's working on Project Poop to understand better what the adult terns are eating that they don't bring home, which I think is a very important piece of this picture. What are the adults eating and what are they bringing home for young? So we're working with Gemma to understand that. We do monitoring of feeding rates at Great Gull Island. And we get, it seems to us that over the last 3 years, there's much more variability in common terns and their productivity than there is in roseate terns. We've had 3 really nice roseate tern years. We are just beginning to do standardized provisioning watches on roseate terns. We'll be going into our 3rd year this year. We're seeing we're seeing river herring, we're seeing herring. 2 years ago, we had a massive mackerel year. Just here came the mackerel. I think it's fair to say that for the most part, we are not seeing roseate terns dependent on amidites, that they're more diversified maybe than they were 20 years ago. But I don't know that we have data from Gull Island for 20 years ago.
And post-breeding, you get a lot of dispersal to southern New England coast?
Yeah, Peter Payton and Juliet Lamb are working on dispersal with GPS radios. Of course, Jeff Spendelow has been doing it for a long time, looking at the roseate terns who leave Gull Island, reading PFRs. So the commons and the roseates disperse differently. The roseates mostly going to Cape Cod. I haven't looked at Peter and Juliet's maps for the common terns, but I think they have slightly different patterns. And we can follow up on that, or you could reach out to Peter to ask him those questions.
That's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to move on, right, Allison?
Yep, sorry. This
so
is a really awesome discussion. I hate to cut it short, but please continue to put questions in the chat. I know Joan will be available to answer questions tomorrow as well during our roseate tern session. But we're going to move on to our at sea surveys, which Chris Haney is going to be moderating. Thanks, Ruth, for your great work.
And I want to, and I do want to thank the speakers for this session too. Great job. Like I said, very diverse talks. Thank you.
We can't hear you, Chris, I think. Yeah.
We see you unmuted, but unfortunately can't hear you.
Yeah, you should make sure that you're connected to the correct mic.
Is Greg here and available? Maybe we can switch your two talks while you try to get the speaker situation worked out.
Yes, I'm here. I can talk.
Excellent. Thank you. Sorry for all the issues Teams is giving us. I deeply apologize for that.
So should I just share my screen and just get started then?
Yeah, feel free, Greg, and
Okay.
Chris can go after you.
Okay. All right. So can you see my slide?
Looks good.
Okay. All right, great. So yeah, thanks everybody for tuning in. I'm Greg Forcey. I'm a senior principal scientist here with Normando Associates, and along with my colleagues Julia Robinson Wilmot and Aran Amihai, we've been working on some bird and bat post-construction monitoring at the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Pilot Project off the coast of Virginia. I'll just be talking about the birds today. But today's talk is primarily going to focus on some interannual variation that we've observed and how that might have implications for application of this technology and studies like this. So the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Pilot Project, so this was a 3-year study of bird and bat monitoring using remote sensing technology with the goal of characterizing bird and bat activity in and around the rotor swept zone. Because it's a multi-year study, we wanted to look at temporal trends, and we also wanted to look at species and any species trends and temporal trends that might have occurred there. And this type of monitoring is really important for understanding collision risk and is particularly applicable for input data into collision risk models. That'll become more obvious as I work through some of the slides here. So the CVAL pilot project is a 2-turbine, 12-megawatt demonstration project, 23 nautical miles off the coast of Virginia. And at these 2 turbines, we monitored in and around the rotor swept zone during the day and night over a 3-year period. So the remote sensing technology that we used was ATOM, acoustic and thermographic offshore monitoring. It's technology that has acoustic, so ultrasound and audible sound detectors on the turbine platform. Stereo thermal videography, which allows for altitude, speed, and direction calculations. A visible light camera to supplement the thermal camera to help provide species identifications, particularly during the day, that we just can't get with thermal imagery alone. And then also there's a VHF receiver, and that's going to be detecting MODIS tagged primarily birds that pass in the vicinity, working on both the 166 and 434 megahertz bands. So I'm just going to focus, even though this was a 3-year study, I'm just going to focus on year 1 and year 2 primarily today. So in year 1, we did monitoring on both A01 and A02. However, that monitoring was limited to 3 defined seasons: spring from April 1st to June 15th, fall from August 15th to October 31st, and winter from January 15th to March 15th. And then on year 2, we decommissioned the system, the video and the acoustics on A02. So we were only monitoring on A01 with the video and acoustics, but we did leave the VHF MODIS receivers on both A01 and A02, and they kept on monitoring. And then unlike year 1, where we had those specific seasons, we did year-round monitoring in year 2. So looking at some of the species composition differences between year 1 and year 2. So we had 31 species in year 1, 37 in year 2. We had loons, storm petrels, shearwaters, and herons were new species groups for year 2. And loons and herons occurred in the first half of January, which we didn't survey in year one because we didn't start that winter monitoring until January 15th. So, we missed some of those potentially in the first year because we weren't doing that year-round monitoring, which reflects the importance of doing year-round monitoring as much as we can. And then common loon, green heron, and Wilson's storm petrel were 3 species that were only identified in acoustics and not in the video. So underscoring the importance of a multi-sensor approach to collecting data that we wouldn't be able to accomplish with just using single sensors alone. So looking at the individual species between year 1 and year 2, we have 14 bird species seen in year 1 that were not seen in year 2, and then 18 species seen in year 2 that were not seen in year 1. So again, underscoring the importance of multi-year monitoring here. So, just looking at the activity throughout the year, these numbers are normalized by turbine in the first year because we had 2 turbines in the first year and only 1 turbine in year 1, or 1 turbine in year 2 rather. So we did see some higher peak abundances in year 1 compared to year 2, where activity was more spread out even after you account for the periods of year 1 where we weren't actively surveying. Across both years, temporally, 68% of the birds that we observed were seen in October. And then if you include September, so looking at both September and October, 83% of the birds that we observed out there were seen in either September or October. So a pretty strong temporal trend there with the bird activity that we saw on offshore. So this is actually looking at all 3 years with the insects that we observed out there. So each year we saw over 7,000 individual observations of insects, which probably represents about less than 5% of the total insect activity. So we did, as the next slide will show, see a lot of foraging out there of birds. So so some of this activity could definitely be driven by the prey base that's out there. So this is looking at the different bird behaviors that we saw. This is looking at video data only because we can't determine foraging from acoustics. But what we saw out there, we classified each detection in the video into a different behavioral classification. And effectively what we saw is that most of the observations were exhibiting some foraging behavior, either catching birds on the wing with aerial foraging, monopole gleaning, hawking, and that was the vast majority of the observations that we saw out there. So the activity seems to be associated with foraging quite a bit. And then we also looked at blade activity and target observations in relation to turbine activity. So in year 1, we saw 72% of the bird activity occurring when the blades were not moving. And then in year 2, we saw a little bit more equal, with 41% of the bird activity occurs when the blades were not moving. So this is key information to consider when fitting and building collision risk models. The collision risk itself is likely influenced by more than just the presence of individuals alone, especially if much of that presence is occurring when those blades are not spinning. And then we looked at associations with wind speeds and activity. So again, this is targets per turbine per month. And we have year 1 and year 1 on the left, year 2 on the right. And this is just looking at passerines. But we do see quite a bit of activity drop off above 5 meters per second, both in year 1 and year 2, with the drop off being more striking in year 1 and year 2. And we also saw similar data to this decline in activity around 5 or 6 meters per second on the frying pan shoal study that we did in 2013, where we had acoustic and thermographic cameras installed offshore on the frying pan shoals light tower. So some supporting data that was seen back in 2013 at frying pan shoals. So same 2 figures, except this is with gulls and not passerines. So we had 177 gull detections over the 2 years. Gulls active out to higher wind speeds than passerines, as you might expect, pretty typical for seabird behavior. So again, we would see if we were doing some kind of fitting a collision risk model, we would expect gulls to be exposed more at higher wind speeds than smaller birds like passerines. So our shorebird data, pretty limited. We had 35 observations across the 2-year period, and nearly all of those were seen in acoustics and not video. So that suggests there's maybe some potential meso-avoidance going on, where they're avoiding the immediate area right around the turbine, which is why we weren't getting them in the video and just getting them in the acoustics. So we're seeing very little activity with shorebirds above 9 meters per second, and this seems to be corroborated by some published research from Loring et al. That showed southbound migration with moderate wind speeds was common for shorebirds. So I've kind of hit on some of these points throughout the talk here, but applications of this data were to definitely understand species-specific exposure, how temporal, and some of the environmental factors that might influence that exposure. Data can be used for collision risk models as input data when doing model fitting. They could also be used to guide minimization and mitigation strategies, as far as trying to understand when birds might be most vulnerable out there. That information would be important for any kind of mitigation or mitigation strategy. And in cases where we have species of concern that we don't have many data points on, it could be also useful to prioritize species for future research endeavors. So in addition to my co-authors that I already mentioned, we thank the Dominion Energy team and the CVAL pilot project for the support of this research, SGRE for coordinating site visits, Atlantic Wind Transfers for getting us out to the turbines, and BOEM for supporting the initial development of the first ATOM system. Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot. Oh, there we go. Chris, can you?
Well, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Thanks for that rebooting. My computer never seems to like Microsoft Teams, so it usually involves turning things off and off a number of times. Thank you all for being here. Sorry I wasn't available there at the outset. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And please let me know. Can you see that?
Not yet.
Still not?
No. Oh, something's coming up.
How's that?
I see Teams.
Oh boy.
And we do have time for a question for Greg, if anyone has that, as Chris is getting this worked out. I do have your presentation, I believe. So if you need, I'm happy to.
Yeah, it's changed a bit. So can you see it now, or part of it?
Not yet.
Well, it shows sharing on my end, but I don't know why it won't.
Hey, maybe we can, Allison, there's a question in the chat right now for Liam, or from Liam Waters for Greg. Maybe we can share that question.
Greg, did you look at wind direction as well? Liam believes that the west or northwest winds would bring more birds offshore than the east winds. And he was also wondering if you recorded any evidence of mortality.
Yeah, so we did look at wind direction in the first year, and we did see it was pretty obvious since most of the birds were seen in the fall. Most of the activity was occurring when you had those winds out of the north and the northwest. So yeah, it was kind of what you would have expected. As far as any evidence of mortality, we have not seen any collisions in the video. There were a few carcasses seen out on the platform that were collected, and there were a few necropsies done. And to my knowledge, none of those necropsies showed evidence of impact. It was mostly due to organ failure or starvation or exhaustion. So the only thing that we did see that's notable that sort of respect with collision is that we did see a few air displacements, and that's just when the bird or the bat got very close to the blades and seemed to have been momentarily confused and kind of was a bit shaken for a few seconds, and then gradually they flew off in the opposite direction. So, but no, we did not see any actual collisions.
And Emily asked if you were able to classify the species broader taxa of the insects.
We did. We were able to classify some of those. I think we have at least 7 distinct species of butterflies. We had a common buckeye, painted lady, and a few others that I'm kind of not recalling off the top of my head. But yeah, we were able to identify some of those targets to species, but that wasn't we didn't try. It wasn't a primary focus of the study. So we didn't do that for all of the 7,000 plus per year that we observed.
That would be a lot. Chris, how's it going there? Do you want me to share what I have, even though it's not the most updated, or?
Sure, let's try that. We still have enough time, I think, for it. I'll just try to remember the order that I put it together a month ago.
Okay, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I've lost a lot of functionality today in the software. I don't have any chat function at all.
Is everything showing up okay here?
It is on my end.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay.
Well, thank you, and thank you for bearing with. I'd like to talk a little bit today about the Gulf of Mexico, and we're going to start with drawing some attention to its peculiarities. And it's an unusual body of water for a number of reasons. It lies at the periphery of the Atlantic Basin. Historically, it has not received a lot of attention from marine birds. And it's also distinctive in terms of its environmental characteristics. It's a very tropical and subtropical water body. It's highly enclosed. There are only 2 water exits in and out of the Gulf of Mexico. And at various times of year, it can be overwashed by massive amounts of fresh water discharged through the Mississippi River Basin. Next slide, please. What I'd like to do today is 3 things. I want to describe a little bit about the methodology that we've used for collecting marine bird data from large vessels in the Gulf of Mexico, a little bit about the scope, the duration, and the size of the survey effort for 3 large vessel survey programs, and then give you some preliminary results that have been applied to specific management actions for marine birds. So this will be a little bit of a different talk than some you might have seen earlier today. It won't be new results. It's actually going to be sort of snapshots of work that has been either finished or is in progress or is soon to appear. 3 large vessel programs in the Gulf of Mexico have been conducted. They all use strip transect snapshot methodology, For the last two survey programs, I'll describe them a bit in a minute. We've used continuous data collection in which birds are mapped or depicted in sort of three-dimensional space. Their bearing from the ship, the bearing of their motion away from the ship or alongside the ship, and the category of height that we happen to observe them in. We use 7 categories on these surveys. Next slide, please. So there have been 3 large survey programs for marine birds in the Gulf, and they had very different origins. The first one was in 2010 and 11. It was a natural resource damage assessment and restoration program. It was in response to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And at the time, it sort of predated some of the more advanced computer input software that is available subsequently. And so while the methodology for collecting bird information was the same, essentially, the scale, the resolution was not as fine as it was in subsequent surveys. Data were collected in 10-minute bins, as was the custom at that time. Since then, the data have been collected continuously. There are some minor differences between the metadata associated with these 3 large vessel survey programs, but for the most part, they are highly comparable. What you see here is a summary by region and season. So you can see that across 4 seasons, we have some survey data from all 3 of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management planning areas. There are some sub-regions that have less data, but it does give us a sense of what birds are there and the times of year that they occur. Next slide, please. The total amount of data is, I think, rather impressive for the time span. Since 2010, we've collected data on effort. This is not the total distance traveled during all of us, but the actual time spent on effort. That data now consists of 74,000 kilometers of data and collected over 700 survey days. In addition to that, there is supplemental data that were collected while the ship was on station. Normally, we use NOAA large ships in the Gulf of Mexico. Those were the Pisces, the Oregon II, and the Gordon Gunter. During the Deepwater Horizon, we also use Coast Guard vessels and some oil and gas supply vessels. If you look at the breakdown by season, you can, again, this histogram just shows you that each of the BOEM planning areas, some data has been collected in each season. And this kind of graph actually helps us pinpoint where we can go and when we can go and get additional data to sort of help fill in the gaps. Winter is always a problem in getting data. So whenever we have an opportunity like a repositioning cruise, we'll take that to get more data. Next slide, please. So I'm going to switch now to some of the applications that we have used to employ this data set and try to address various management actions or decisions. One of the first ones was something before the data report had even been done. The second program that we did was the Gulf of Mexico Marine Assessment Program for Protected Species from 2017 to 2019. Those data were used to construct an aggregate map of bird density or relative abundance. And so essentially what happened here is that 20 plus species were used to create hot spots and cold spots for seabirds in the Gulf of Mexico. The red here depicts the hot spots. The bluer colors, the colder spots, places where there were fewer modeled predicted